This week's lecture is on how the land itself, the land that the dinosaurs lived and breathed and spent their entire existence upon, was always in constant motion. It is for us too today, but we're studying dinosaurs, so we're going to talk about that. This is the whole subject of continental drift and plate tectonics, and so I kind of start by giving you the history of thought in this. And for most of us, this begins with Alfred Wegener, who published this book here in the early 1900s. And his basic idea was that the continents were once together and that they have separated and drifted to their present positions. Now, if we look at map of the world, globes of the world through time, you see the gist of Wegener's idea. So the globe that you're familiar with is down there at the bottom left today, and then those other globes are going back in time 65 million years, 135 million years, 200 million years ago. And you see there I've marked off the different sort of stages in dinosaur evolution existence, from their beginning to their peak to the time of their end. And notice that dinosaurs lived in a world in which it began for them as one big continent and one big ocean that slowly sort of separated them to the point where they were a bunch of different groups or different faunas on different continental blocks through time. Just a couple of words you need to know about. So the big one is that the one world continent is called Pangaea. And if you have one continent, then you got to have one ocean, and we call that Panthalassa. The two terms in red, that's not going to be relevant for us in this course, but I'll mention them just to have them here. The northern half of this Pangaea is called Laurasia. The southern half we call Gondwana. Remember, dinosaurs originate in a world like this with one big continent, nothing really obstructing them from motion across this thing, and ultimately they lived many, many millions of years to the point where this thing separates. Well, what was Wegener's evidence? So first of all, his evidence to suggest this was that there were similar rock types on all of the southern continents. If you looked at the rock types in all the southern continents and you mapped, say, a mountainside of them, of the different rock types and the different ages, you would get these little strips of rock that they've sort of shown here as these little multicolored vertical strips. And you see there that the same multicolored vertical strip that one finds in Antarctica, you find in South America, in Africa, in India, and Australia. And if those are the same rock types, that implies that all of these places were together at one time, all of these rocks were formed at that time, and that since that time, these things have spread apart or drifted to their present position. He also noted that if you look at the map of things, you've got all of the southern continents especially fit together like puzzle pieces. And in particular, pay attention to the fit of Africa and South America. This week I've also included a link to a YouTube page that shows a nice little video about, you just need to watch the first 3 minutes of it, showing the separation of South America from when Africa and South America were connected to a point where they were not as far separated as they are today, because this process is still going on, but far enough apart so that the dinosaur faunas on each of these two were on different land masses. And then his third bit of evidence came from fossils. Now, all of these fossils predate dinosaurs by at least 100 million years, but they're all different groups that, for whatever reason, either they were freshwater creatures that couldn't cross oceans, or big beefy creatures, cow-sized creatures that could not swim across oceans, or plant types that could not sort of get dispersed across oceans. Again, he said, Wegener mentioned that all of these things, it's easier to imagine them living in one place and kind of walking, swimming, dispersing over this one area, then imagining them all sort of crossing giant ocean basins. It's much, much harder odds than winning the lottery. And you've got to imagine these things doing it several times. Here's a better picture of the same thing with just some more sort of descriptive nature of these different beasts, Lystrosaurus, Cynaegnathus, Mesosaurus, and Glossopteris, and how, again, it's easier to imagine them all on one landmass that has then separated to where we find them separate today. Well, continental drift eventually becomes what we today call plate tectonics, but we're going to make a first stop along the way to something called seafloor spreading, or SFS. Now, here's a map of the world today with the oceans drained away, and you see all kinds of unique features at the bottom of the ocean that we really never see. And slowly but surely, the decades after Wegener presented his ideas on continental drift, we began accumulating evidence that showed how this happens. And the first part was noting this very unusual mountain range that goes down the central part, or the mid-ocean part, of all of these ocean basins. And the thought came up and was expressed as the hypothesis of seafloor spreading, that there were data from heat flow, data from earthquakes, and data from volcanoes that indicated this. Now, paleomagnetism, very, very important, but I'm not going to have you learn this in this class. The gist of it is here, notice that the sea floor is spreading apart. Well, what's the heat flow evidence? This map here shows the heat flow over the globe. Basically, where heat from the Earth is hotter, it contains the warmer and warmer colors from yellow to orange red to dark red. And these are areas where there's high heat flow. Notice it makes these nice long linear features that roughly coincide with those giant mountain ranges at the bottom of the ocean I talked about. If you also then plot up earthquakes, every dot on this map represents an earthquake happening, and again you see these same linear features. Now, distribution of volcanoes, these are just volcanoes that have penetrated the surface. If they actually showed volcanoes at the bottom of the ocean where the ocean's drained away, you would have that same set of linear features. So all of these things lined up: heat flow, earthquakes, volcanoes in the central part of the oceans. Now, about the same time we started learning about the deep structure of the Earth, the fact that we have a hot molten core, a lot of heat here, rising, and that we live on these continents that are part of this outermost crust of the Earth. From continental drift to seafloor spreading to plate tectonics, there's been an evolution of thought such that today we know that the Earth has a crust, the outermost layers, the crust and the top part of what we call the mantle. They're hard, they're brittle, and they're broken into pieces that we call plates. So it's not the continents so much moving around. So when you see North America here, it's not so much that the North American continent is moving around. It is, but it's part of a bigger chunk of the Earth, the North American plate. And North America, the continent, we know, and half of the northern Atlantic Ocean and a good chunk of the Arctic Ocean, that's what's moving around together. And it's moving around because of heat flow from the lower portions of the Earth. Now go back to this picture here. I just grabbed this one of earthquake events, seismic events. We also know that there's high heat flow at these places and also lots of volcanism. These are places where convection cells, heat is rising from this deep Earth. And it's analogous to what I always point out is like a coffee cup. If you were to map the distribution of heat in your hot, steamy coffee cup, you've got areas where hot material is rising. We've got it over here in the warm color over here. But you also have in that same coffee cup areas where colder coffee is sinking. So you set up what's called a cell, where you've got hot material always rising and colder material, slightly colder material, always falling. Now, a different view of a coffee cup shows the same convection cell, but what about the surface? Here, this person has all this sort of milky foam on the top, but you could also imagine, sprinkles of chocolate or nutmeg or anything. All of this stuff, which is like the crust of our Earth, is just the scum at the top, and it is in motion. The heat flow down here forces a motion of the material at the top here, which would be the motion of the crust at the top. Now, go to the Earth. The Earth is just a giant coffee cup with convection cells, both big and small and deep and shallow, constantly cycling heat from the lower core of the Earth to the upper part and moving the continents around this way. If we look at a plate tectonic map, this is a map of the Earth where the surface has mapped out as different colors the major plates of the Earth. And again, here's North America. The continent is here, but remember, I said it also includes huge portions of the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. It is these different color patterns, not the continents themselves like Wegener thought, but chunks of the Earth, the surface crust, continents and ocean bottoms, all moving around because of this plate tectonic motion, convection cell driven from the core. Now, we have places on planet Earth that we call divergent boundaries. These are places where any two of these color patterns, wherever you see one color touching another one, we say, well, are they moving towards each other, moving away from each other? If they're moving away from each other, we call this a divergent boundary. Just a few rattle off basic facts. It's caused by tension stress. It generates this seafloor spreading. So in a sense, it's the start of this plate tectonics. What we find there, extensive volcanism, many shallow earthquakes. It's the start of this giant mountain range that I mentioned at the bottom of the oceans, this mid-ocean ridges. But most importantly for dinosaurs, what I write down here in red, it separates the land masses. So, the bottom of the oceans, you have this scenario going on. You've got divergence like here. Anytime you see two arrows pointing apart from each other in a geological diagram, it, without a doubt, represents a divergent plate boundary. Notice in the center here, you've got the nice warm colors. There's that heat flow, generating earthquakes, generating volcanoes, and it literally is separating the ocean here and spreading it apart. Well, that's what's happening in the oceans. What about on land? And this set of diagrams right here goes from an area where the land is starting to crack and break and separate, beginning the separation and then getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now this is in reverse stratigraphic order. The oldest is at the top, youngest here. But if we sort of separate it out to the way I want you to know it, you've got the Triassic period, which remember was the start of the dinosaurs. And we have this Pangea supercontinent. The dinosaurs, if they wished, could migrate from pole to pole. But it's during this time as well that Pangea starts breaking up and we start getting divergence. So you see here you've got heat rising, it's cracking and breaking this outer crust of the Earth. You see some smoking hot areas right here, and then there are those ever-present divergent boundary arrows pointing in opposite directions. From then the Triassic into the Jurassic, we get a domination of land faunas by the dinosaurs. They reach their heyday in the Jurassic, and this is during a time when the plates are continuing their divergence, which makes the continents start their separation. And dinosaur evolution ramps up in a big way. We're going to cover evolution next week, and we're going to show the connection between plate tectonics and the evolution. But again, suffice to say, here's this situation here from the Triassic into the Jurassic. You've got a world that's starting to break apart, and little small shallow ocean basins start separating these land masses. Now, some dinosaurs might have been able to swim or wade across these when they were young, but if this continued, and it did, into the Cretaceous, these plates begin to diverge and the continents separate, and basically we start making the giant ocean basins of today, such that dinosaurs on this green landmass here on the right were completely isolated from dinosaurs on this green colored landmass over here. This diagram sort of shows these dinosaurs longingly looking out over this giant ocean basin. They can't possibly see to the other side, but completely different dinosaurs are evolving and living on the other side of this. So this is sort of just tipping my hand here. This plate tectonic evolution from land masses all together to separating, diverging to this, it's going to have a big forcing factor on the evolution of dinosaurs. Remember, you've got the notes set for this week, but also I want you to watch the little short video on the separation of South America from Africa that gives you an idea of what's going on during this time period.